Hello and welcome to the My School channel. My name is Angela, and in this video we're going to continue the government topic by topic video lesson. So we're moving on to a new topic, Colonial Administration 3, putting it all together. So here we're going to discuss the socio-cultural, political and economic impacts of colonialism on the entire West Africa. So please stay with us, don't go anywhere, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the My School channel. Like I said earlier, we are discussing Colonial Administration 3, putting it all together. So let's dive right into it. So here are a list of topics that we're going to be discussing in this video lesson. We're going to do a recap of the British and French colonial administration. We're going to compare the British and the French administration in West Africa. We're going to look at the various economic policy and developments in West Africa during the colonial era, and some of the positive and negative impacts of colonial administration. Then we're going to discuss the concept of imperialism and neo-colonialism. So let's begin with the recap. Alright, so in the last two video lessons, we were talking about the British and the French colonial administration. We talked about all of the various things that occurred during their time here in West Africa. So now we're going to look at what we discussed briefly. So we talked about how the British were primarily driven by economic motives. They were seeking raw materials for their industries and new markets for their goods, while the French, on the other hand, were driven by economic motives, were also driven by the idea of spreading French culture as they believed it was superior to the African culture. So there is a difference between the British and the French in this sense. So for the British people, they were primarily driven by economic motives. They had that motive of seeking raw materials for their industries back home. So that was the reason why they came to colonize the British West African population. The French, on the other hand, though they were driven by economic motive, they also had this civilizing mission here in West Africa. They came to civilize the West African people and to integrate them into the French society. So that's the primary difference between the British and the French colonial administration. So under the British rule, British colonization began with the annexation of Lagos in 1861. So that's how it began here in Nigeria, and continued with the charter offered to the Royal Niger Company to sign treaties with local rulers in southern parts of Nigeria. Remember, they were driven by economic motives, so they wanted to make treaties that allowed them to trade with various regions within the country, and so they signed this treaty with the local rulers in the various regions in Nigeria. So their rule was finalized with the establishment of protectorates, the northern and southern protectorates in Nigeria. So in the late 19th century, they divided Nigeria into the northern protectorate and the southern protectorate. Together, they make up Nigeria, but this was not what happened until later on in the early 20th century. So the British adapted the indirect rule system, where they used the existing traditional rulers to govern the people on their behalf. So this is what happened. They made use of this system so that, we talked about how there were different reasons why they adopted the indirect rule system. One of such reasons is the fact that they did not have enough financial means to adopt a direct rule system. So they made use of the traditional rulers to help to collect taxes and to implement policies within the various regions, while not having to spend money on salaries and every other expenses needed to directly rule the people. So there was also the warrant chief system, which was also introduced in the eastern region, where no centralized structure existed. In the eastern region, where the Igbos lived, there was no centralized leadership in that system, and as a result of that, they needed warrant chiefs to be put in charge of the people to help to implement policies and also collect taxes from the people in the eastern region. So that's why they introduced that warrant chief system in the eastern region in Nigeria. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, now we're going to discuss the French colonial administration system. So the French colonies were directly ruled from Paris, with a centralized administration that placed significant power in the hands of French officials. So there was a direct rule system in the French colonial administration. Local rulers were sidelined, and traditional institutions, customs and traditions were eroded. So unlike the British system, where you had traditional rulers ruling on behalf of the British people, here there was a direct system. The local rulers were sidelined. They implemented leaders to lead various regions within the French West African society. The French initially pursued a policy of assimilation where they sought to turn African subjects into Frenchmen by adopting French language, customs, and laws. So the policy of assimilation was the policy that they used to administer their affairs in the States. This policy was harsh. It excluded many Africans, especially in rural areas. Its benefits, only a small elite group was granted French citizens. So the only elite group that was granted French citizens were the 4 communes in Senegal, people that belong to the 4 communes in Senegal. We're talking about Dakar, St. Louis, Rufisque, and so on. So these 4 communes were the only regions that were given French citizens, especially when they meet certain criteria. So when the policy of assimilation failed, the French adopted the policy of association. So this policy involved some recognition of local systems of government, but still kept much control in French hands. So in this case, they decided to adopt this policy of association because they faced a lot of criticism as a result of the policy of assimilation. The African people were not okay with this system because it was eroding their culture. They were not allowed to participate actively in the governance of the African people. So they have to replace that with the policy of association. But later on, the French adopted a hands-off approach and allowed Africans to govern themselves while still being part of the French Empire. So that's it for the French rule. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, now we're going to discuss the difference between the British and the French colonial administration. So one of the things that differentiated them is colonial motivation. So while the British people colonized British West Africa primarily for economic reasons, the French had this desire to spread French civilization in French West Africa. So that's the difference. Here, it was primarily economic, but here, though it was economic, it was meant to civilize the French West African people. So they had this civilizing mission in West Africa. Then in terms of the approach to governance, there's indirect rule in the British system. Traditional rulers and local structures were used as intermediaries between the British governors and the subjects. So here, for the French administration, there was direct rule. There was a centralized administration from Paris. And the French aimed to integrate their colonies into France. Then in terms of policy, the British governed through local chiefs and kings, so they had that indirect rule system and the warrant chief system in the eastern region of Nigeria. So this was their policy of engaging with their subjects. They ruled indirectly through local chiefs and kings, and then they maintained local power structures under British control. But for the French people, France assimilated Africans into French culture, but later adopted the association policy, which recognized African culture but still asserted French dominance. So that's the difference. Here, there was a hands-off approach. They allowed these local chiefs to implement policies on their behalf and to collect taxes on their behalf. But here, they were hands-on. They were right there in the various regions, collecting the taxes, implementing the policies. So and that difference is in terms of the administrative structure. While the British administration administered via protectorates, the British officials, including district commissioners and residents, had direct oversight. But for the French colonial system, they were administered using governors and secretary commanders. So here there is a decentralized approach. Here there is a centralized system. These district commissioners and residents, they were just there to supervise what the local chiefs were doing in those society. But the governors and secretary commanders here were hands-on. They were the ones doing the job of collecting the taxes and implementing the policies from Paris. So now let's move on to the next slide. All right, and that difference is in terms of citizenship. The British people did not offer citizenships to their African subjects. Although in the beginning, when Lagos was annexed in 1861, for a while, Lagos residents were regarded as citizens of the British society, but that changed when Lagos was integrated into the Southern Protectorate. So there was no citizenship offered after that. The Africans there at that time were regarded as subjects or protected persons and not citizens of the British Empire. The French promoted assimilation and offered French citizenship to a select few educated elites. So this was restricted to the 4 communes in Senegal and not other French West African territories. And so this led to dual citizenship. So these members of the 4 communes of Senegal, as long as they met certain criteria, they became French citizens as well as citizens of French West Africa. So they were given full rights to these members who had dual citizenship, but other people were regarded with, other people were given a second-class status. within the French West African society. So another method of differentiating between them is through their cultural impact. So the British allowed the Africans to practice their customs and traditions as long as it did not break British laws. But the French were more determined to impose French culture, their language, and their laws on the French West African people. So local cultures were seen as inferior, and there was a strong effort to assimilate African subjects into the French society. Then in terms of political associations, the British allowed the formation of political associations in her colonies. So political parties were allowed to exist after 1922, when the Clifford Constitution was introduced and the elective principle was allowed. Political parties were allowed to form, and so there was a form of freedom for the African people to express themselves within the British colonial administrative structure. But when it came to the French administrative structure, France opposed and suppressed the formation of political parties, which delayed the nationalist efforts of French West Africans. So now let's move on to the next slide. So now we're going to discuss the economic policies and developments in West Africa. So the economic policies and developments in West Africa during the colonial era were primarily aimed at benefiting the colonial powers. So while these policies contributed to the economic growth of the European colonies, they had mixed results for the local economies. So we're going to discuss some of these policies. So it's important to note that it benefited the colonial powers. Although it benefited us on some level, the local community on some level, but most of these policies were designed to benefit the colonial powers and not the colonized. So one of the economic policy was the economic exploitation of raw materials. Though it was not phrased in this way, we understand that when they came here, their primary reason for colonizing us was to get as much raw materials as they can to their industries so that they can be able to create finished goods that they can sell to other countries and improve the British economy. So the primary aim of colonial economic policy in West Africa was the extraction of raw materials for the industries. These raw materials included agricultural products like cocoa, palm oil, groundnut, rubber, cotton, and timber. So these were the raw materials that were extracted from the West African society. We also had minerals like gold, tin, and diamonds extracted as well. The British and French administration controlled these resources and exploited local labor to extract these goods for export into the European societies. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, there was also infrastructural developments. The colonial powers built roads, railways, and ports in order to facilitate the transportation of these raw materials from the interior to the coast for exports. So they needed to be able to transport these raw materials from the places where they were extracted to the coasts, to the ports where they can move them on to the European society. So the British built extensive railway networks in Nigeria and Ghana, which allowed for easier movement of crops and minerals. The French built similar infrastructure in their West African colonies, especially focusing on the movement of cotton, peanuts, and other agricultural products. However, this infrastructure was designed to benefit the colonial powers, and it was not intended to support the economic independence of the African colonies. So colonial powers developed key ports such as Lagos, Dakar, and Abidjan. These were the key ports in West Africa. And these ports handled the export of goods. They were critical for connecting the colonies to the European markets. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, we also have a cash crop economy. So West Africa became a cash crop economy as a result of the policies that were implemented within the society. So under colonial rule, much of West African agricultural economy was reorganized to prioritize the cultivation of cash crops, so which were grown for export rather than for local consumption. So when we're talking about cash crops, we are talking about those crops that are produced mainly for export rather than for local consumption, for eating within the local community. So they were focused more on those products you can export to other countries. So an example is how the British promoted the cultivation of cocoa in Ghana and palm oil in Nigeria, and how the French focused on crops like cotton and peanuts. So this led to a decline in subsistence farming, that's farming for basic consumption of food. That's what we did in our pre-colonial era. We farmed in order to provide goods that we can consume immediately, food we needed for sustenance. So there was now the dependence of the local population on imported goods for their own consumption. So they were no longer producing those things that they needed to feed. They were now importing food for local consumption. As a result of that, there is kind of like a deficit because you might be exporting some products, but you're importing a lot of products for feeding the entire population. So the emphasis on cash crops often led to food insecurity, as farmers were incentivized to grow export-oriented crops at the expense of food crops for local consumption. And this loss of autonomy over food production made the local economies vulnerable to the global market fluctuation. So what we're talking about here is something that continues to impact West African countries to this day. We continue to import goods that we need for consumption rather than producing them here in our local community. So this is one of the effects of the economic policies of the colonizers, the British and French colonizers here in West Africa. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, we also have the introduction of taxation. Colonial governments in West Africa imposed taxes on the local population to finance colonial administration and infrastructure. So these taxes were paid in cash, which pushed the local population to produce cash crops or work on European-owned plantation and mines to earn more money. Again, they can no longer focus on subsistence farming. They have to focus on producing cash crops in order to be able to pay the taxes that were imposed on them by the British governments. They also have to work on European-owned plantations. Rather than working on their farms, they have to work on the farms of the Europeans in order to get the cash to pay the taxes to the European authorities. So this system of taxation led to further exploitation of local labor and the alienation of indigenous peoples from their land and economic practices. There was also the exploitation of labor. Colonial powers relied on forced or poorly paid labor to work on plantations, in mines, and on infrastructural projects. So this included the use of forced labor, where local populations were required to work for low wages or sometimes for no pay at all. We saw a lot of that in the French colonies. When we talked about the French Colonial Administration, we talked about how some of these laborers were made to work on the French farm for free. There was a period where they were required to work on these farms without pay. So the forced labor policy was especially harsh with the French, using the indigenous system, a policy that allowed colonial administrators to impose severe restrictions on African labor to exploit the local people. So these are some of the policies and developments in West Africa that continues to impact the West African countries to this day. So we've come to the end of this segment. I believe it was insightful. Please, if you would like to continue with us, please go down to the link in the description below. This takes you to my school website where you can subscribe for the government topic by topic video lesson. I hope to see you there. I believe you enjoyed this content. If yes, please don't forget to hit the like button, click on the subscribe button, and lastly, tap on the notification bell to get informed as soon as we release the next videos.